case is called Designing the Dark Sides. Anyone that knows me would know why it was called that. So, as Jeff said, I'm a speculative designer, and my aim within design is to concentrate on speculative culture regarding political, technological, and scientific advances, and more specifically focusing on the aesthetic and poetic sides of that. So I'm going to present Everything Ends in Chaos, which is a recent project that I did at the Royal College of Art. I just graduated there with Elliot, actually, guys out in the audience. So it's called Everything Ends in Chaos, and there's a really important reason why it's called that. So I put it in quotation marks because in 1774, when the founders of Lloyd's London met together for the very first time, they decided that their business model would be everything ends in chaos, so we're going to make a profit from it. And that's genuinely written in the very first script within insurance contracts, which I think is interesting and quite dark. So the intention of the project was really to kind of shed some light on what's been happening over the last 3 years. So we've really been confronted with a financial chaos of sorts, the recession hitting hard, and trying to really not necessarily look into areas that we might not necessarily understand, but kind of highlight certain bits that are invisible or in the darker sides of economics. And most people would argue that economics is quite dark anyway. So I found this risk interconnection map from the Zurich risk debates, because I went to a risk conference and they started talking about the interconnection of risk from an insurance perspective, and it's really quite interesting. So reinsurers often use this model to perceive what's good and what's bad. Not that there's ever very many good things happening. So my initial look was if I could possibly map something more idiosyncratic onto a more global scale. It proved to be really, really difficult, as you can imagine. So the definition of the Black Swan. So one is to outline the realm of regular expectation. Oh, sorry, what am I talking about? Outside the realm of regular expectation, so that would be events, scientific, technological, historical. 2, it carries an extreme impact. Now, this extreme impact's a kind of a funny, very grey area. So it could be human extreme impact, it could be scientific, technological, historical. So it could extremely affect one person's life. I believe that Nicholas Taleb used the example of a turkey being slaughtered. It has no idea 10 minutes before it's going to be slaughtered whether it would be or not, but as soon as the butcher pulls out the knife, the extreme impact hits it, and that could be considered a black swan in a turkey's life. So 3, which is my favourite one, is that human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. So 9/11 would have been an example of this. So there's quite a famous quote from former United States Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. So there are known knowns, there are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know. But there is also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, we don't know. So I think that's probably the most intelligent thing anyone's ever said in the US calendar, and maybe the nicest way of explaining what it is I'm trying to talk about. So this project essentially, or initially, not that it failed, but was a quest to try and design and then reverse engineer a single, but hopefully magnificent black swan. Magnificent meaning aesthetically magnificent, as I imagine chaos to be. So I came across this front cover of the Hiscox brochure, and this just lit up my little face. So this was the spark and the magic that started the project. So it's such an obviously beautiful way of describing insurance, and it makes the mundane coffee drinking insurance brokers kind of interesting. So there was an example that I also came across where Hallmark, the biggest insurance policy to date that was reclaimed or objects brought back was the Hallmark Setting Fire to Christmas story, where Hallmark sent out tons of snow globes around the globe when people were buying them at Christmas, and the snow globe was creating a small flare that was setting fire to Christmas trees inside people's houses when the sun was out. This to me is like the most beautiful image of Christmas. It's just quite hilarious, so it kind of drove things further. So at a risk conference, it was really where I got interested in insurance, and I think insurance is a really important tool within the potential narrative of Black Swan, because it's the way we really access finance on a very domestic level. Everyone is aware of what insurance is. I'm sure if you ask a child, they probably are aware of their parents talking about insurance of one way or another. So Sam Evans was a senior broker at BPL, Lloyd's of London, and he had conversations with me. I couldn't show his face. He didn't, all the brokers and the investment bankers that I spoke to didn't really want to be recognised. So he started talking about really sort of what to him would be very normal occurrences, to me would be very strange. I don't know whether that's because I'm English and it's just a weird idea to think that the Big Lebowski plot could potentially have happened, could have been real. Or this example, the example at the bottom from the FPH in the USA, is a very genuinely real diagram to try and sell people kidnap and ransom insurance. So the bit I like the most is the other, so what the outcome would be. I have no idea what that would be, whether it be falling in love with your kidnapper, like it was all a dream or something really obscure like that. But it's, yeah, rescued is 7%, which is kind of upsetting really. But at least the ransom's paid. So he also said, you know, occasionally a finger will end up on the broker's desk sent by a FedEx. And this to me is kind of a really powerful image. And he was really genuine when he said it. He said a brown paper bag, you tip out and the finger rolls out. And they're like, okay, we know what to do. We wrap it up, we know who the client is. They test the DNA, and that's a genuine test. So they test the DNA of the finger and they know which client sent it. Maybe the wedding ring has been photographed previously in the evidence. And they release the ransom. Well, that's what they're told to do. So, thinking about fingers being cut off, and the interesting part is knowing in kidnappers, how on earth did they know that there's a process involved of chopping off a finger, or in my fictional story, chopping out a breast implant. But it's this kind of series of unfolding narratives that I'm really interested in. So this was called Driving Mr. Obama, and this is a fairly accurate depiction of the motorcade that Obama uses when he travels anywhere. So you can see that it's really odd. So the cars will change. How would you describe it? So they would change depending on the route that they were taking. So that the control cars might go in front of the support cars. So they change formation depending on the risk. So the mitigated risk is, I guess, determined by what's going on at the time. And then it says, like, 9 times out of 10, Obama won't be in any single one of these cars. He'll be floating in a helicopter above that no one's watching. So these are just to show that there's the security involved. And it, on average, costs $500,000 to transport Obama for an hour anywhere. And then started looking at environments where architecture plays a role within risk and how it kind of works in a very real security tested environment. So Gerald Hoffman did these playground series, which is small villages that are designed so that you could simulate a chaotic event, and so that the securities and FBI and such could go in and make sure that they could handle those situations and those scenarios. This project originally started from a project I did called Predictable Anomalies, which was trying to determine if I could have President Bush killed via a spearing of an American flag into his back, and how I would accurately do that. I spoke to physicists at Imperial College, I then got into the topic of insurance with someone and what kind of contingency plans could Obama put in place to know that he wouldn't have been killed this way. So the ring on the floor, the painted ring, was put there by the insurance company. So if he was to step inside of that ring, then predictably he could be speared on that day if they worked out exactly the measurement of the wind speed and so on. And then I went in to create 50 different images of probability. So it's more likely he was dragged into the basement, shot in the back. If you were going to murder a president, that would probably be a more elegant way of doing it. And then if you were to go further, he probably would be hidden behind here somewhere. You'd never leave someone a body out like this. Or altering facts, like there's a bald eagle and it could have changed the trajectory of the flag. And he could be speared anyway, and you never know. So insurance companies would write endless contracts for these kind of scenarios. So this, taking this in mind, so after various research and talking to various professionals, and what I mean by professionals is I spoke to a director at Goldman Sachs, and I spoke to a loss adjuster, and I don't know whether you know what a loss adjuster is, but they're a professional body that show up at an incident of the insured event. So say someone's car goes missing, they would show up and assess whether the victim or the client was lying or not. So they would conduct a series of tests and look at the evidence. So like, you know, if there's a wheel sat there, they're kind of like a forensics team for finance. So the way I presented this in the interim show at the Royal College of Art was as if you were to dissect these elements and find the evidence. What might you find in two sets of narratives? And this reveals, like, there's Mrs. Henderson, she's been kidnapped, and she was kidnapped via using this car, and there was a board of directors that was involved, and it went on and so forth. So I really believe that policies can be read as fiction because that's exactly what they are until the speculation becomes true, and that really does apply to insurance. It's kind of like making up stories and insurance companies hoping that they don't happen, but making the client believe that they could possibly happen, making them hand over their cash. This is very dark, but this was, I started to imagine what kind of visuals could come out of policies. So referring to this, if you were to speculate on what the images were when you read a policy, what might that look like? It's quite difficult to see, but when Mrs. Henderson was kidnapped in my narrative, I'd imagine that when she was kidnapped, she was cut up and various things were sent to her husband. And when, upon her arrival home, her husband might have invited a plastic surgeon to their house so that they would have a party to welcome her, but also the plastic surgeon could be there ready to operate. And that's a very real, strict part of the policy that you can claim on insurance. So say my lips were cut off by some guy, you know, my husband didn't really want to look at me with my lips chopped off, and he, in his very right within the policy, could invite a surgeon to our house, so if I returned, he'd fix me immediately. This was another part of the plot. There was these are just sketches, these are original sketches for when planning the films that I made. So this is the part in the boardroom. I'll explain the narrative in a bit, but this is a section where board members were sat around a table and there was a golden bomb that hung above them. They worked at a missile factory and someone had planted a bomb within the bomb itself and waiting to blow them up when they all met together at one stage or another. But this was more kind of looking into how the policy might look visually. So moving back to how the Black Swan was integrated, so it's really hard to design a Black Swan scenario because by very definition it's completely impossible. So it took about 9 or 10 different maps. So I started literally just by sketching how many scenarios I could come up with. And this roll of paper was about 5 meters long. It just kept going and going and going. And in the end, I was really getting nowhere. So during doing this, going through this process of doing this, I would go back to my investment bankers and go back to my insurance brokers and to try and figure out the genuine equation of what could be considered a black swan, and is it the most profitable black swan or not. So eventually it kind of shrunk into a more tangible map eventually, and then my assessments would continue. And then it kind of drove me a bit mad, and I had to put a desk between 2 doors to continue because the space was running out. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting song. The final outcome of the project led to a series of multimedia artifacts that kind of lay on top of a table that would detail the fictional scenario that ensued. The scenario was made up of 12 different events, starting with Mrs. Henderson. She was a woman that was kidnapped within a car. She was dragged out of the car, and the kidnappers stole her diamonds. It's really difficult to describe this narrative. They stole her diamonds, and the diamonds were taken and used for smuggling, and the smugglers put them into doves and tried to. I'm not explaining this very well at all. Forgive me. It's such a complicated narrative. Well, I'll go on. This is the table of objects. So it kind of lay out the detailed map of what was going on. So parts of the map to accompany the table of objects, there was a series of films, and the tables are kind of horrific monstrosity of events, so they're quite dark, and the videos are meant to emphasize the beauty that was within the darker sides of insurance. So yes, this horrific stuff is happening, and yes, there are people profiting from it, and there's a lot of money to be made, but there could be useful moments within that you should relish. So really, a black swan could be quite delicious to watch. So this is another image of the boardroom table. So this originated from the other sketches. So I'll show you. So this was the films that accompanied the table. So this particular section of the story was when Mrs. Henderson's diamonds were stolen, the kidnappers force-fed doves to eat the diamonds so that they could smuggle them easier through airways instead of taking them through an airport. And whilst en route to deliver the doves to release them properly, the sunroof opens and the doves escape by themselves, so they never really find their real owners, so they're just lost. And in the story, Mrs. Henderson's cat grabs a dove mid-air and returns it to her as a gift, as normal cats do, and returns all of the diamonds to her as she arrives home, missing her breasts and her fingers. a meeting that takes place within a boardroom, and it's the kind of moment before the explosion. They're waiting for their 10th board member to arrive, who's late because the Doves, upon release, caused a traffic jam and a FedEx van crashed into the guy that was supposed to be attending the meeting. So he avoids the meeting, saving the insurance companies a lot of money. Because within insurance, if a CEO dies, then it's worth a lot of money and loss to a company. But if he doesn't, it doesn't really matter in policy terms whether the rest of them die. As long as the CEO doesn't, then there's much more of a profit to be made. Also, in the narrative, there's an alternative ending to display two kinds of policies. So there's one where a bomb has been planted in the missile, so it was deliberate, and there's one where exterminators a week previously used too many bug bombs, which could ignite, because they're lighting their cigars, could ignite the bug bomb and blow up the room separately. So there's two kinds of different juxtaposed policies within that. And this is Mrs. Henderson. She returns home to her house. She's obviously quite a wealthy woman. For a party, so she's all dressed up, ready for a party, but she's kind of severed, maybe dismembered slightly in her husband's, kind of celebratory, but not very happy. Hopefully she looks like she's in despair. So I'm just going to briefly talk about how it was made, because I honestly do think that my making is as much a part of the design stuff that I do as well as the design of it itself. So the Doves were real. They were shot from a crane on the rooftop at the RCA, and that's a real dove poking its head out. So this was a green screen, and we cut a really tiny hole in the green screen and released the doves with the camera filming here, hoping to God that they flew in the right direction. A lot of them didn't, but this is that scene. So this was the Limericky originally, which was a bit of a nightmare as it didn't work, as you can see all of the roads still attached. But this was the shot of the limo, so the two were composited together in various ways. And the limo just drove underneath the camera at a certain speed. So the boardroom was actually this shot from above in the same way, but it was only shot at one angle because I never really anticipated that I would move the camera up the boardroom table. So I had to paint the rest of the table in and make it up as it was moving along. So I shot this with a friend, Tommaso, and he's the guy sitting here. And he was only filmed once because he's the same guy in every character. So it had to be kind of strategic timing of counting to 5, and this guy pours this guy coffee whilst this guy's talking to this guy. And they hand over documents and various things. And so it took a long time to kind of composite them all in, every 10 of them. And the missile was just modelled and stuck on top. The Henderson part was filmed in the Wallace collection in London, but I was only given 15 minutes to film, which was kind of really difficult considering you weren't allowed actors in the room because they weren't allowed to touch the antique furniture. So I had to green screen Emily into the shot and all the other various characters and all the other pieces. So that was quite a challenge. Also, there's a clip that I didn't show you that kind of never really got finished, but was the most invested time in, which was a scene where the guy that's late to the board meeting travels up the elevator and the room explodes and he witnesses it. He gets hit in the elevator by the debris. So we built this air cannon that shot debris through the lift. And there's a small, tiny video that's quite... so this is the very rough setup of that.
One move. You ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, go!
So that was shot at the high speed, obviously not there, but that's the kind of DIY methods that was used in making this film. And I guess what the work is trying to illustrate is that there's a very real system involved in deliberating how financial schematics hit each other and how they move in the world around us. And there are obviously, it's not rocket science, but there's very real things happening and they get much darker. And I think the darker side to it should either be considered or celebrated. I personally feel that they should be celebrated, because they are what makes things interesting. They've put us in a difficult position at the moment, but aesthetically they could be pleasurable. And I think that looking at design or a darker side of design as being a pleasurable experience could allow us to delve deeper into what we find interesting and maybe what we find horrifying. Oh, I'm not finished. So I'm going to briefly talk about the next project. It's very brief as it's still at kind of research stage. So the idea is that I'm trying to design a speculative heist for a casino. And what I mean by this is, so this is a story of a man that stole poker chips and fled on a motorbike, which is a very common story in Las Vegas of people kind of hijacking and running. But I mean a literal heist in the very traditional cinematic sense of trying to access the vault whilst no one's watching, or using trickery to try and access a vault. So there was a really other interesting article about a woman, or a series of women using laser phone scan, which is using lasers that were DIY put together on their mobile phones and trying to signal to each other via lasers. But casinos have a laser tracking system that could triangulate the position of lasers within like a tenth of a second, determining foul play within casinos, which is really interesting. And obviously there's a very cinematic perspective to hijacking casinos, which I kind of want to touch upon. It's obviously a very delicious thought to wanting to rob a casino. It's quite seductive, and when we watch films like Heat, I know Heat's robbing a bank, but it's kind of on the same realm. Ocean's 11, maybe not so much, but it's the most kind of Hollywood encounter of trying to rob a casino. And try and maybe bring people closer to a realistic view of what it would be like to rob a casino, and maybe speculate upon the kind of tools that they would use to do so. And that's it.
Cool. Thanks. I'd love to actually just like start a couple questions just exactly where you left off. You were talking before the presentation began about this idea that what you want to do is maybe not necessarily the overall narrative of a heist, but actually design speculative tools that someone would use in order to gain access to the space. And I wonder if you could just talk briefly about what those tools might be, but then also the nature of casino construction that you were discussing briefly, and how those tools would engage with that very particular kind of architecture, and what that design moment represents.
Okay, so so I guess moving more into a speculative space, we imagine casino vault breaking in, or if you were to watch Ocean's 11, you could kind of kid yourself that it might be quite an easy task to pull off, with a lot of, talking about it in a room somewhere. But maybe we could use tools, design tools that would interact with the kind of technology that you read about, or from my research read about. So Jeff and I were talking, and I was saying that when employees of a casino enter a lift, there's various laser scanning devices that will scan your body shape and know your body shape over time. It will also take into account the kind of whether you're eating too much and you've gained weight over a strict period of time. But if you were to suddenly have a brick in your stomach, like a box of chips or something that you were trying to smuggle out of the casino, the lasers would detect that anomaly. But they would also scan like suitcases. So if you had a suitcase and the lasers hit the suitcase, it could possibly scan it on the way out and determine whether or not you were stealing, or so on. And Jeff pointed out that actually in certain lifts, it would measure the weight of each person within the lift. What example did you use? It was
just a friend of mine who worked in casino security 20, 30 years ago was saying, this is secondhand, but that the elevators at the casino where he worked could measure the weight of the people in it. And so in this particular case, 3 security guards from the casino got into the elevator, and they all should have weighed, the elevator knew they should have weighed 450 pounds altogether, but instead, all of a sudden, out of the blue, they all weighed 550 pounds, or give or take. And what had happened is one of the guards had basically stuffed himself with either coins or chips, and like dozens and dozens and dozens of pounds of these things. And so when they got out of the elevator, they first had been found with the stuff that he was trying to steal. So it was kind of a weight capture device inside the elevator.
So moving on to how the speculative objects is taking these technological aspects, whether they be true or not. I mean, you read a lot of things, and 9 times out of 10, that technology doesn't exist, and it's just a kind of a ploy, not necessarily sent up by casinos, but written by technologists to presume that the technology is more advanced than it really is. But kind of design devices that could combat or take into account these kind of technologies within casino vaults. Like, could you somehow make yourself lighter in a lift, for example, when you're stealing the money? Or how on earth do you get the cash out without these lasers detecting you? And could we design tools that could possibly reflect or refract those kind of lasers away from you? So really presenting an audience with a kind of a fictional series of objects that you could presume in one way or another, without linking them up. So I wouldn't say, this is for blocking lasers in a specific lift, but presenting them with a tool set that you could imagine being able to use in a casino. I mean, I'm sure you couldn't go online and just buy a casino heist kit and it to work exactly. I'm sure there has to be a lot of DIY involved with research, and maybe presenting this as the narrative itself, and just giving people clues, kind of more like an anticipatory narrative to heist. Does that answer you?
I have a question. Where does your focus lie in like the whole action? Is it on those tools? Is it on the action itself? Is it on the actors? Like which one? Like what bears kind of the
So for me, it's more presenting a space, and whether that, well, mostly it's architectural, but presenting a space in which people can imagine themselves situated within, being able to possibly use these tools. Kind of more like an anthropological study, so not necessarily inviting people to go in and steal, but if someone was to steal and I was to go and investigate that and pull it apart into various fragments, what on earth would those fragments be? Like how many hairs would be left over when the casino vault doors close on the guy's hair as he moves and it gets trapped in the door? Or these kind of really small human-centric elements that are left behind, or we could imagine being left behind.
Yeah, kind of. I just don't understand this perspective, like when you're looking at technology and when you're looking at people, because like, are you analyzing technology and where it came from in like analysis of human body and like the way it is being kind of used in these like power structures, like casino, or are you looking at like people and the way they are like able to deal with it, or like why are you trying to, like, for example, penetrate casino like as this institution that has such big security? Like, I'm trying to understand kind of the aim.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of what the other project was trying to do, in trying to put an emphasis on the pleasure of calculation. So if you were to calculate, and if you were to go through, like, I guess this project might take me about a year to do, or 9 months or so often. But if you were to kind of witness someone's really, really niche anal calculation of how to specifically rob a specific safe with a specific serial number in a place in Las Vegas, like the Bellagio or the Intro Grand or whatever, take pleasure from that kind of calculation. I guess the way graphic designers design type, in the same kind of necessity, and enjoying it as an imagined event. So in most of my work, I'm not interested in characters, really. I mean, really, they're just people that move around the space that kind of not, I guess, not flourish or it's more about what people do with something, and not necessarily focused on the human-centric side, but more a strategy and a strategic. Does that make sense? Yeah. If it doesn't,
yeah.
It's without being tacky, and it's not tacky, but if you were to, I don't know, a kind of a CSI kind of flavour, but with a bit more rigor. Like I'd love to see, you know, in a very morose way, maybe not a pleasurable way, but kind of what the plans would look like for maybe 9/11. There's an intrigue there, whether it be good or bad. Not necessarily good, but there's an intrigue to how someone could possibly facilitate something so planned and organised.
Along those lines, you were saying that what you've been doing in the States for the last month is the work you described coming up in the elevator was fascinating. And I'm just wondering if you could just tell everyone what it is that you're doing now. These are the airplanes and the...
Oh yeah, so I'm being funded for it's more than 6 months, about a year's worth of work for the American government of airlines and homeland security. So my job essentially is to do research. Every 3 months they will fly me on one flight, and I have to write a report, a photographic documentation and sketches as to how I would possibly disrupt and terminate a flight mid-air. So it's about designing speculation essentially to bring down a plane, to test their security systems. So it's not about me being a security expert, it's about understanding that people who would want to blow up a plane are creative people, and they're not security experts. Why on earth would a security officer test his own system over and over again with a really boring, you know, a guy walks in with a bomb, well that's pretty obvious, but what are the real, you know, could you stick a marble between the door to keep the airlock open? forcing it to jam open at a certain time in the flight, or something DIY. So how could I possibly smuggle that stuff through an airplane? So that's what I'm doing at the moment. The idea is that it will be published into some sort of book that works with inside the division in Homeland Security, which is really unfortunate because I can't display any of it unless I kind of tweak it all and say that it's some art project, which is probably what I'm going to do.
It's interesting, when I moved into an apartment in Chicago about 11 years ago, it was the first time I ever actually read my apartment renter's insurance policy. And it was fascinating to just sort of see the types of events that were considered predictable enough that they could be insured against versus things that would be so random that insurance companies had no way to account for them. One of them was a falling satellite, so if a satellite fell out of the sky in my apartment, I wasn't insured.
There's lots of space junk experts that insure space junk falling from the sky.
Oh wow, okay. Well, that actually came up just about 2 weeks ago. There was the piece of falling, there was a satellite that was falling to Earth, and people were trying to figure out where it might be, and there was, at any one moment, you were more likely to be hit by this satellite than you were in the lottery and that kind of thing. But these kind of weird mathematics of events and the likelihood that it might strike you, I think is really interesting that there's a kind of typology or a kind of catalog of events that can happen to human beings, and then there are companies that go through that catalog and decide which ones are profitable and which ones aren't.
I spoke to a guy when doing the project. I spoke to a guy at he was an ex-Lehman Brothers associate, so he calculated derivatives for Lehman Brothers. And when they went bankrupt, he was hired back with them to, what he would do is he would hunt companies that owed the money, because Chapter 11 doesn't exist in the UK or in Europe. And he would go and ask companies like the Bank of China, give us back our money, you owe us a lot of money. So he would work on an American side, and he was saying, I lost my train of thought. He was, what was he talking about? He was saying that, I can't remember what I was going to say, that's awful. I've dealt with insurers for the last 9 months hardcore, so it's just so many things. Keep talking and maybe it will come back to me.
Well, yeah, no, I just thought that this idea that there could be a kind of master book of events and event types, and some of which can be considered profitable, others which are kind of universal losers, I think is really quite interesting. And even if that master book of events doesn't exist, it makes an amazing art prop. You know, the kind of prop that you go to a gallery and you can see this kind of book of all of the events and event types that could befall human beings.
Well, and exactly where the line of profitability costs, because you can buy earthquake insurance here, but you can't buy it in California, so that must be.
Just the state.
What, yeah, the state has to do it, but so then it's not really insurance because the state's bankrupt.
But also, I think it's just fascinating too that like narrative is built into the insurance industry in a way that you saw it after Katrina in particular, where there were arguments, or in fact any disaster where was it wind that knocked down the levee and therefore caused a flood, and therefore you can be covered by the insurance that you have, or was it entirely an act of flooding, in which case you don't have flood insurance and you're screwed? Like, did wind blow over something in the backyard, in which case again water damage can be accounted for. But so the whole thing comes down to this almost is that like Robert Brie type novel of trying to analyze this exact sequence of events and find causation and responsibility and the point at which history inflected and went in a certain direction, and that's what the insurance industry does. So in this weird way, which I think is so interesting about your work, is that the insurance industry, they become these master narrative manipulators, and not necessarily in the bad sense of manipulation, but it's all about micro narrative, micro responsibility. And I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's even like, I'm sorry to speak longer than I should, but even like when you mentioned that detail where maybe a bald eagle might fly and disrupt air currents, and then the spear will miss the president. Actually goes to a question I wanted to ask, which is that like when you're putting these things together, it's interesting where there's extreme specificity in heist films in particular, where to the point where it seems like that's a plot hole. Like the entire bank heist all came down to whether or not that policeman would get stopped in a traffic jam. And they couldn't possibly have predicted that, so the whole movie seems to fall apart. But you can take that and go the opposite extreme and do an almost Amelie style or City of Lost Children style infinite series of events where you let the rats go here because that chases people out of this theater here, which puts them into traffic there, which causes this event, which does this, which does that, and and then your characters win. Anyway, so I don't even know where I'm going with this, but except for when you're putting these projects together, if there's that risk of on one side plot holes, and on the other almost like a kind of Amelie, like twee, sort of annoying cutesiness, you know what I mean, where it's like it all depends on whether or not a bird flies through at 3 a.m. on Thursday, and then 2 weeks later there's a bank heist because of that.
Well, that was the difficulty in trying to, when figuring out that narrative, I didn't really explicitly talk about the narrative very well, as it's just literally a map on the table. It's kind of really difficult physically to go through exactly what it was. But that was kind of trying to get a balance of what was conjecture and what was not, and I had policies on the table in various places within the narrative, suggesting. So if you read through the policies are real, they were written for me by the insurance brokers for the project. So I gave them a list of characters. I said, here are your characters. This is their net worth. This is who they're related to. This is the series of things that happens in their day, and their career is this, this, and this. Calculate for me how you would possibly insure those people's lives in a way that relates to the narrative. So they wrote about 600 documents. So the total net worth of the project, I don't mean obviously the physical project, but the total net worth of loss that they calculated was 8.26 billion. So if my narrative had gone for real, not that necessarily would happen, there'd be an $8.6 billion loss on the series of events, and they would say, well, we would have made a profit here of that. I do still have the balance sheets that they wrote for me, and I did exhibit them, but people found it far too difficult to really grasp what the balance sheets were talking about. Because I spent so long with them discussing it, it kind of made sense in the end. But what I was going to say about the Lehman guy was I asked him, what's the probability? I was having his team run numbers on the probability of the president dying with a flag. And he was saying, oh, there's someone already calculating this, don't worry. And he was really genuinely right in calculating different ways that the president would die. But the problem is the mathematical models are normally based on, say, Kennedy's death, a bullet hitting him in the back of the head whilst he's driving in a car and things like that. He said the biggest insured organisation in the world is the Vatican, and they own, they have ridiculous, coming out of their ears, like rooms filled with insurance policies. And he had to go and negotiate with the Vatican to get money back from Lehman Brothers. That's kind of the secret story, but he said that they was the toughest solicitors and lawyers he's ever had to deal with in the history of him ever having to go to anywhere. So they were the toughest mothers of insurance, and that they wouldn't budge an inch on anything. So they're essentially trying to sue the Vatican for the money that they owe Lehman Brothers. So there's a kind of really twisted link up with that.
This is just kind of a general question that may not be the most fascinating for everyone, but I guess I'm interested in the idea that in two things that are both kind of pertain to this like UK America divide, which I think is interesting, which is that one, that Black Swan book that you mentioned, Nicholas Tillett, is well known in the United States, but it's not nearly as big a bestseller as it is in the UK, where it just seems like it's almost like the Da Vinci Code of the UK. Like everyone in the UK has read the Black Swan, as far as I can tell. I'm deliberately exaggerating, but it just seems to have a popularity there that does not correspond to its popularity here. But then also in the UK, you can bet on everything. So you can bet on, Nikki and I joke about this a lot, like you can bet on whether or not David Beckham will have a beard in 10 years in September of 2021. Like you can actually bet on that. Yeah,
it's funny you should say, I made a bet on the royal wedding, hoping that it would turn into a Black Swan and that I would win a lot of money. I bet £1 on an 8 million odds against me, hoping to God that it would pay off, but it didn't.
What did you bet?
Yeah, what did you bet would happen?
I bet 3 scenarios. One that, it's an obvious one, that Kate would leave William at the altar. 2, that there'd be an assassination attempt on the Queen. And 3, that William was gay and he decided not to turn up. So they were quite liberal. You can't go into much detail in a betting house, really. So
it's amazing that you can put a pound on anything in the UK.
Yes.
You just put a pound on the fact that it will rain next Tuesday. If
no,
someone
for sure,
really
yeah.
wants, you're done.
But isn't that, I mean, in a funny way though, isn't that exactly, like that is the insurance industry though, right? Like, I mean, you place a bet on whether or not, like you could probably take an insurance policy that says that, you know, my wife, if she comes out as a lesbian in 10 years, then I get $1 million or something like that.
yeah, you could have an issue.
But so does that work? It's just
a long
interesting that that's the
discussion.
insurance industry, not the betting industry. But, you know what I mean? Like, what's the division?
Well, there is no, the real reality to it is there is no division. So I spent a long time discussing with the brokers I was dealing with, could you bet on losing love? And they said, well, if love had a physical manifestation, which sometimes it does, then yeah, you could insure your wife leaving you. And I don't mean leaving you for various assets, but for loss of the heart, you could bet. So if it caused you a heart attack if your wife left, then the insurance policy would cover you. What was weird in the kidnap and ransom insurance documents, because I had someone write a real one for myself before I put up the show at the RCA, was that, say, if I had a husband and I was kidnapped, it would cover my surgery bills, it would cover someone to pick me up in the car from the kidnappers and deliver me home. It would insure the surgeon on his way to the house. If he was in a car and he got into a car accident, it would insure that to send another surgeon. But it wouldn't cover my husband losing time off work due to stress, so it wouldn't cover that. And if he had a heart attack after seeing me dismembered, then it wouldn't cover that either. So it's just a really, really strange, the idea is that I could try and figure out every kind of niche for the kind of possibilities within the narrative. So there's one piece in the narrative where her finger gets cut off to start with, Mrs. Henderson, and it's sent by a FedEx van, but the FedEx van crashes, delaying the finger, so the kidnappers get angry and cut out a breast implant instead. Because breast implants are now used as insurance assets because they come with a serial number, so they can track the victims depending on the serial number, whether it matches the blood or not. It's kind of really, it's really strangely, yeah, it's really dark. And the guy that I spoke to, Sam Evans from BPL, spends his life insuring missiles and the probability of them being stolen when they cross borders in Pakistan and places like that. Yeah, he's a lovely guy though.
That's incredible, actually.
Well, so one thing that I was curious about is all of these things that insurance brokers are imagining are usually translated into language, and no one reads the fine print unless they do, you know, but rarely do you actually read the fine print. So your way of, it strikes me that you're sort of creating visuals of fine print. Have you, in some ways, like,
yeah,
does that seem like?
I did and I didn't. Like I did. I mean, it's really hard to see on the table, but there was actually printed out fine print that people could read if they so wanted to.
So to accompany all the steps on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so sorry. It's so difficult to kind of display the project without seeing it because the narrative is so. So here, like these contracts, they would make another twist in the story. So, say for example, okay, this is a bird lock. So, we would presume that the doves were transported in a cage when they were in the limousine. Now, if the doves had been stolen or not, if they'd been stolen, then there'd be no insurance to cover the doves leaving, and they could be a rare type of bird. So, if the doves were to escape and they were insured and the lock broke, which it did in this, I haven't got a detailed picture with me of this, but it's kind of a broken lock. That strategically changes things massively. So it either swings, imagine if it's a scale from 0 to 100, and it swings one way or the other. So you either profit or you really, really don't profit, or you either lose money or you really, really don't. So in this case, if the doves had been stolen, they wouldn't have been covered anyway because, you know, the broken lock's irrelevant. But if the kidnapper had actually bought these doves legitimately, and the doves are insured, and oh my God, they escaped, let alone the smuggled diamonds within them, you've got a problem here. Or in this case, if the lock had been put together properly, then they would get the money back from the doves. But if it wasn't, then they wouldn't. And there was a really weird, when they were making their assessments, they kind of said, well, Mrs. Henderson's diamonds, if they were legitimate diamonds, you would presume a woman of such stature to own, if they were taken from her and she had an insurance contract taking out on the diamonds, which I did have a contract for the diamonds. It's called a species policy, which is really strange, but in that policy would state that those diamonds would have to be fake to cover any kind of damage sent back to her, because within an insurance policy they will only cover the diamonds if the respected client was to take responsibility and not wear diamonds out in public. Yeah, so it's just absurd. So if her diamonds were real and they were sent, they would never pay for it anyway. Whether the doves, you know, left or whether her fingers were cut off or whatever. So they would really be fake plastic ones. The doves would have had to have swallowed plastic ones if she wanted to get her money back. So it kind of goes on and on, so it's kind of like a really strange, I guess the idea was that it would be confusing to look at and that you could spend a good amount of time, which is really difficult in a gallery space to do. I totally know that from speaking to people, but yeah, if you were to really spend time kind of nourishing the certain narratives that swing one way or another with the project, then hopefully you would get more of a dense picture, and not necessarily, it's not very linear, you know, it doesn't go from A to B and it dies, it's kind of very, very changing.
What's funny about it to me is just that, as well, that it strikes me that the fine print then is full of these, like, it's almost like that kind of novels in 3 lines scenario where the fine print ends up being like the shortest possible, most precise description of something that could be fantastically
I mean, they're seriously kind of meta-skimming the situation.
Yeah. Just
ridiculous ricochets of like the strangest occurrences. Like, you know, the FedEx van, if in any way that the logo had been dented on the van, and not the van itself, then you could get more money because it's ruining your image because of the skewick logo. So it's just like really, really smart ways of determining things. There's a really famous, it was really famous in the insurance world recently, where insurers have come up with a poll re, which is essentially, it's a new contract written for post 9/11, where insurance companies used to cover terrorism insurance for buildings and contents. So if a terrorist hit your building with a bomb, then you'd get money back, essentially, if you could prove they were terrorism. And insurance, there's no strict rule as to what terrorism is. So if a kid drives its bike into my leg, I could technically say that was terrorism. It's really, really strange. So now that that's not available and no one will insure for it because investors don't want to put their money into that kind of this policy-making profit. Now they've invented something called a poll re, so they'll sell you buildings and contents insurance as a poll re that will cover terrorism in its finest print. So they're just calling it something else, but it's covered terrorism under your buildings and contents. But it won't cover things like floods in buildings and contents insurance. So they've kind of figured out a way to slap a new policy on top.
Do insurance companies, did you discover a bit about how they brainstorm scenarios? I mean, do they go away on, creative retreats
Actually,
and come up with things?
I didn't mention that. It's the weirdest thing. So there's various different levels of hierarchies of the way these companies work. So there's a broker, and they brokerage the contracts.
Yeah.
Then there's systems analysts who are basically mathematicians that are continuously calculating stuff. So a broker would get a series of statistics landed on their desk. It could be what a hurricane is tomorrow or so on. What they would do is they wouldn't necessarily they'd take about 10% of those statistics into mind, depending on the likely probability or not. And then they have investigators that are watching the client without the client's prior knowledge. And the client would never know that they were being investigated. So there was an incident where I think it was this sultan, some sort of sultan was cheating on his wife or something, which broke his insurance contract regarding the insurance of his palace or something like that, because there was a weird conflict of interest within the policy. So there's all sorts of really strange moments. Like there's insurance companies sitting on the board at the UN, which is just, to me, when he said it, and I was like, no. And he's like, no, really, there's insurance company representatives sitting on the board at the UN to see if countries are beginning to conflict or not, because they can change their premiums depending on what those possibilities are. And then there are people like loss adjusters, as I said, that come in, and they kind of come from pre-experience. So because I wrote a book for this. I wrote a book that was published by the Oxford University Press to accompany this project, and they kind of started to. When I interviewed a loss adjuster, he was talking about. There was a really massive piece of art, I think it was a Richard Long, that went to a gallery in Australia, and it was made of metal, and they were like, it just disappeared overnight, and the guy came to investigate, like, well, it's massive, you can't pick this thing up. They're like, where the hell did it go? And after like a month of walking around, there's two things a loss adjuster takes, is Wellington boots and a suitcase everywhere they go. Apparently they're the necessaries. He turned up, he spoke to everyone he knew. He was like, how the hell do they move this? There were no tyre marks in the floor, on the grass where it was taken. And there was this guy that was running a college he was a technician for a workshop. And he was building a boat, and the boat looked strangely familiar. And they were like, what the heck? What's the metal that you used on the boat? And he said, oh, I found this bit of junk that I melted down. And it was a piece of artwork. So it was a complete accident, but the insurer got all the money back because it was an accident and it wasn't deliberate. But there's lots of really strange things. Like the same guy said that he was investigating someone for burning down their house, or the insurance company thought they burnt down their house on purpose, and then it turns out this guy murdered 12 people in his village at the same time. And he was. So that had to be taken into account, whether paying his client back or not. So there's just like strange, really strange anecdotes to everything. Like when insurance companies were invented, I guess, they had specific fire trucks that would drive around the city, and they would only put out the houses that were on fire that were insured. Yeah. Which is kind of a strange thought. Yeah, it's just
Welcome to
amazing.
Health insurance
Yeah,
in the
it's
US.
just amazingly fascinating, and it's really difficult to capture, I think.
I was actually going to just ask that actually, as far as your work. I think it's interesting that you're producing the objects or the props that correspond to these stories, and but yet it's so obvious that it takes such an incredible amount of time to like talk about them. And so I'm wondering if do you feel like there's a different medium that needs to be discovered, or do you have the great insurance novel inside you that's waiting to come out, or is that why you're attracted to film because it allows these kind of non-linear editing?
Well, actually, honestly, I was going to say a book. I think books are really the only way to looking at a gallery, even giving this talk. I mean, it's hard to experience the piece without looking at it. I do think films are a medium that are getting closer. But if you were to watch any of those films without necessarily me talking or reading a bit of text, there's no way in hell that you would be able to figure out what they were related to.
Yeah.
But I think by showing a little bit of vision within what insurance could possibly equate to, it sort of brings people into a space which makes them want to read. It's not necessarily the best tool for communicating, but if you can intrigue people and seduce them into something where they become fascinated enough to actually stand and read, then maybe there's a closeness to that.
It reminds me of it was either J.G. Ballard or Don Lewis. I think it was Ballard, the greatest novel of the 20th century was the Warren Commission report. But it'd be interesting if the greatest novel of the 21st century was an incredibly detailed insurance brief, produced for the Sultan of Brunei or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to write one of those.
I think we can leave it there unless you guys have another question. But otherwise, that was a fascinating presentation and talk. So thanks, Ilona. Appreciate it.